Hello, I'm Margot Politis. Welcome again to Study English IELTS Preparation. Today we're going to look at cycles, at phrasal verbs, and then we'll finish with a bit of punctuation. But now here's a man who is a microbiologist and a mushroom grower. He's talking about mushrooms and the part they play in the carbon cycle.
They occur naturally in the forests as wood-degrading fungi. That's their job. When trees die, they grow on the tree. They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
The speaker, Noel Arrold, is talking about how mushrooms grow naturally. They are an important part of the carbon cycle. But what is a cycle? A cycle is a process that is repeated over and over. It goes around and around. But how do we know this from listening to Noel?
When trees die, they grow on the tree. They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
He says, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on. By saying the cycle goes on, he is telling us that this process happens again and again. At the end of the description, you need to signal that the process goes back to the beginning again. We can say the process goes on, the process begins again, the process repeats itself. In a cycle, there is no real end or beginning because the process just keeps going. When describing a cycle, we need to start somewhere, then describe in order each part of the cycle. There are many different ways of describing the stages of a cycle. We can use transition signals like when, once, then, or next. When speaking, you can also use pauses and intonation to describe a cycle. In written language, this becomes punctuation. Listen to Noel Arrold again describing the different parts of the cycle.
When trees die, they grow on the tree.
He says, when trees die, they grow on the tree. When trees die, comma, they grow on the tree. The first part of the cycle is that the trees die. The second part is that when the trees die, fungi grow on the trees. That's the next stage.
When trees die, they grow on the tree. They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms.
Okay, he says that the fungi break down the lignin and the cellulose. They break down the tree. So the third stage is that the fungi break down the tree. Fourth, they produce mushrooms.
When trees die, they grow on the tree. They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil. And so
He says, in turn, organic matter goes back into the soil. In turn signals the next stage of the process. In turn means next or because of that. That's the fifth stage. The organic matter goes back into the soil. And then what happens?
when trees die, they grow on the tree. They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
The carbon cycle in the forest goes on. The organic matter helps new trees to grow again, and then those trees die. We're back to the first stage again. This is the carbon cycle. Okay, now we're going to look at some phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs consist of a verb followed by a preposition. This forms a new verb, sometimes related to the original verb, but sometimes not. Phrasal verbs are idiomatic. There's no pattern to the meanings they take, and they often have a number of different meanings. You often can't just guess the meanings of phrasal verbs, you have to learn them. Let's look at the phrasal verbs in this clip.
They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
There were 4 phrasal verbs. They were break down, end up, and 2 using go. Go back and go on. Notice that sometimes the preposition will give you an indication as to what the phrasal verb might mean. Let's look at these 4. See if you can match the meanings. Break up, end up, go on, go back, and finish, continue, decompose, return. Well, break up means to decompose. Go back means to return. Go on means to continue, and end up means to finish. But notice that break up can sometimes mean finish as well. We can break up from school. In formal writing, we would be more likely to use words like continue or return than phrasal verbs, which tend to be less formal. Phrasal verbs are difficult to learn because there are so many of them. Look at go. We've already seen it with go back and go on, but there's many, many more. And remember, most of these have got more than one meaning. It takes a lot of time to get used to all the phrasal verbs and what they mean. You need to listen carefully to people speaking and the way they use phrasal verbs. Another important thing to do is to write them down in groups and buy a good phrasal verb dictionary. So pay attention to those phrasal verbs. Learning them in groups can be fun, and your spoken English will sound much more natural. Now we're going to look at some writing tips. For variety, it's important that you use a lot of different sentence types of different lengths. The difficult thing is finding the balance. You can join together short sentences using conjunctions, but what do you do with sentences that are too long? This sentence has many ideas, all joined together with and. How many ands are there in the sentence?
They break down the lignin and the cellulose, which is the most resistant form of carbon, and they break it down, produce mushrooms, and in turn you end up with organic matter going back into the soil, and so the carbon cycle in the forest goes on.
There are 4 ands. This sentence is too long and should be edited. The ideas can be broken down into smaller groups and shorter, clearer sentences. There are several ways of doing this. We can use punctuation, conjunctions, and connectors. So let's have a look. Here's the full sentence. We can start by using punctuation. Use a comma to separate clauses. Use full stops to separate complete ideas. And you can replace some of the ands with full stops. But remember, the new sentence must now start with a capital letter. Now we have a clear paragraph expressing a number of ideas with different kinds of sentences. And the carbon cycle goes on. But we can't go on. It's time to end this episode of Study English. But I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Welcome to Study English IELTS Preparation. I'm Margot Politis. We're going to look at articles today, indefinite articles a and an, and the definite article the. But first, let's meet an oceanographer. She's talking about using underwater devices to predict weather patterns. See if you can hear her using articles while she talks about monsoons.
The monsoon gets a lot of its energy from the equatorial and subtropical Indian Oceans. Dr. Susan Widgefalls, an oceanographer from Australia's CSIRO, is hoping that by measuring the state of the Indian Ocean in those areas, scientists will be able to learn something about monsoon predictability.
Predicting the monsoon is a very difficult thing, and yet it impacts on millions and millions of people, and so we think that if we can predict the monsoon usefully, we could make a real difference. We know from El Niño that it's a fully global system, so you can't just study one small part of the ocean and solve these problems. You really need a global, integrated observing system, and the Argo program is the first real big ocean attempt to do that, and it's the float technology that's allowed us to even think about doing this.
Using articles before nouns is one of the most difficult things about learning English. You can choose between indefinite articles, a and an, the definite article the, or no article at all. Let's start with the indefinite articles a and an. The rule is that a is used before words starting with a consonant, and an is used before words starting with a vowel. So we have a banana, but an apple. There are a couple of exceptions to the rule. Where the consonant H is not pronounced, we use an. So we say a happy man, but an honest man. The H is not pronounced, so honest sounds like it starts with a vowel. And where the vowel U is pronounced y, we use a. So we say an umbrella, but a user, because user sounds like it begins with a Y. A and an are only used with singular nouns. We use some with plural nouns. The indefinite articles a or an are used to refer to indefinite things, things that aren't specific. You use them when you're referring to any member of a group of things. The indefinite article does not refer to a particular thing, but one out of many possible things. If I say, I would like a banana, I just want any banana, it doesn't matter which one. Let's look at an example of indefinite articles from the clip.
Predicting the monsoon is a very difficult thing, and yet it impacts on millions and millions of people, and so we think that if we can predict the monsoon usefully, we could make a real difference.
She uses the indefinite article twice. She says, predicting the monsoon is a very difficult thing. There are many things that are difficult to do, and predicting the monsoon is just one of them. Secondly, she says we can make a real difference. There are many differences that can be made in the world, but she is just talking about one of them. So when do we use the definite article the or the? Well, we use it when we're referring to definite, specific things. We also use the when we're talking about one particular member of a group. Luckily, there is only one form of the word the, and it can refer to both singular and plural nouns. We say the banana and the bananas. There is a difference in pronunciation though. When the comes before a vowel sound, we say the apples. So the before vowel sounds and the before consonant sounds. Let's look at the clip again. Listen for the.
You really need a global, integrated observing system, and the Argo program is the first real big ocean attempt to do that, and it's the float technology that's allowed us to even think about doing this.
She says the Argo program. She uses the because there is only one Argo program. It's a unique particular thing. She also says the float technology. She is talking about that particular type of float technology, not just any float technology. There was a third the. She said, the first real big ocean attempt. We use the in front of first, second and so on because they refer to something particular or unique. There can only be one first attempt. In the same way, we use the in front of superlatives, the best example, the biggest banana and so on, because there can only be one best or biggest of anything. Okay, so that's the major difference between definite and indefinite articles. But there are other rules as well. We use a and an with countable nouns. That is, if the noun can be counted. I ate an apple. Apples can be counted. We use the with uncountable nouns, with things that you can't count. I swam in the water. Water cannot be counted. I drank the milk. Milk cannot be counted. We also use a with counting expressions like a bottle of, a cup of, a bit of. Listen to this.
The monsoon gets a lot of its energy from the equatorial and subtropical Indian Ocean.
She says the monsoon gets a lot of its energy. Look at the monsoon and the Indian Ocean. These are both examples of other rules for the. We can use the to describe generic nouns. A generic noun is a noun that describes a category or type of thing. It can often be the same as using a plural noun. So sometimes the monsoon means the same as monsoons. She's talking about monsoons in general.
Predicting the monsoon is a very difficult thing, and yet it impacts on millions and millions of people, and so we think that if we can predict the monsoon usefully, we could make a real difference. We know from El Niño that it's a fully global system, so you can't just study one small part of the ocean and solve these problems.
And here's another rule. We use the with oceans, seas, rivers and deserts. We say the Indian Ocean, the Yangtze River, the Gobi Desert. We also use the for points on the globe, the equator, the Tropic of Capricorn, the North Pole. Choosing the right article can be very confusing, but if you follow the general rule that you use the definite article, to refer to a particular thing or things, and a and an, indefinite articles, to refer to one of a number of things, you shouldn't go too wrong. Okay, so now we've seen how to use definite and indefinite articles. But sometimes we don't use articles at all before nouns. Let's look at when to use no article. We've already seen that you can leave the article out when talking about plural generic nouns. Monsoons are unpredictable. But this is true for other generic nouns too. Coffee is delicious. Happiness is hard to find. Balls are round. Okay, so let's look at some sentences. I would like a cake. I would like one cake, any cake. I would like the cake. I would like that particular cake. I like cakes. I like all cakes. Here, cakes with no article is generic. It refers to cakes in general, all cakes. Well, that's all for today. Don't forget to practice those articles, and I'll see you next time for Study English. Bye-bye.